Hello and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and it's great to have you join us today. Earlier this week, you may have heard of a landmark decision coming out of the Supreme Court. Essentially, the court faced a situation where California public schools were allowing children to quote-unquote transition without informing the parents. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of parental rights, which is obviously a huge victory. So on today's episode, Father Shannon Boquet and I discuss this court ruling, what it means for parents, and what the proper relationship between parents and the state is when it comes to education. As always, if you're listening on our audio platforms, please pause and leave us a 5-star review and subscribe to the show. This helps boost the show to new audiences. And if you're listening on YouTube or Rumble, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that you can get new episodes every Thursday. Without further ado, please welcome Father Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
Colleen, always a great blessing after returning from the mission field.
It's wonderful to have you back from the Philippines. And I am super excited for today's podcast because we're going to be talking about the recent Supreme Court ruling, which ruled in favor of parental rights. So, Father, could you just begin by telling us about this? I haven't been following it super closely, so I don't know a lot of the details.
So obviously, this is something that just happened yesterday. So I'm still reading and still studying the case itself, reading some of the writings that are around the articles, but also trying to read the decision of the court. And the one thing that, for our listeners, this has been about a 3-year battle. So this involves California.
Of course.
Like, sadly, a number of our states that have taken a position that parents' rights and the rights of children, are always in relation to the state. The state has the preeminent, responsibility, for the education and formation of children. So what the Supreme Court basically said, California, you're wrong. Right? Because parents are the fundamental teachers of their children.
And this specifically had to do with schools that were transitioning children without the parents' knowledge. Is that correct?
That's correct. Because the issue revolved around basically the California public school system hiding from parents their children who may be struggling with gender dysphoria and were considering, quote unquote, transitioning, and that the teachers had the obligation to keep that information from the parents. And so it's again, a 3-year battle that's been ongoing. And just to let people know that the U.S. District Court Judge and Menendez actually ruled in favor of parents. This was back in December of 2025. Okay. And so actually, his writing is very, very interesting. I'm still reading it, so I can't go too much detail to explain, but I found his insights to be very, very good. And also it opened more of a conversation about, not only the First Amendment, not only about religious liberties and religious freedom, but just the rights of parents, and also to be able to have other issues that revolve around our Constitution, like, separation of church and state, but also the issue of class action suits. And, I find it interesting, because, having, working on the degree in bioethics, one of the semesters, it was on law. And we had to study cases. So I find it still, I've learned some technique in reading. So I've been enjoying that. But I think it's good for our audience, especially this is a subject I'm going to write on for Spirit and Life. So this is forthcoming. So basically look at the links and that's going to help people. But here, what I found interesting, and I want to quote from it, that the majority of the court's decision in this case of yesterday, so it was a 6-3 decision. And basically what the court said, right, was that parental rights, including the right not to be shut out of participation in decisions regarding their children's mental health, end quote. It's a direct quote. So the court recognized, the violation of parental rights and excluding parents from a life-altering decision in their children, who are minors, by the way. Right? So we're talking about minors. And so, but imagine, again, just the state here, the public school system of California, supported by its governor and its legislative body, hiding issues from parents. As I sarcastically said in a recent article, you can't even give an aspirin, to a child without a parent's permission. But we can hide drugs and we can hide potential surgeries from parents. It's amazing. It's truly amazing. So the court, saw through it, of course, from a First Amendment position, 14th Amendment as well. But ultimately, what I appreciate, and I've been reading again the decision, is to see how parental rights have been lifted, So this is a landmark decision. It really will have repercussions across the legal field, across the states.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the example of the aspirin as well, because I actually, when I was going back to prepare for this episode, I was reading one of your articles from a couple of years ago where you used the example of Tylenol, where it's like a school can't give a child a Tylenol without the parents knowing, but yet they can start calling them other names and using different pronouns and helping them transition, live out their quote unquote transition at school, even if they're like still in line with their biological sex at home. Exactly. And so just how absolutely ludicrous that is. And I believe that this was also a fight, and probably still is, in the pro-life movement regarding abortion as well. I remember when I was a child, there was all the talk about parental consent laws and not letting children under 18 get abortions. And so it's obviously the fight for parental rights has been something that's been going on against the culture of death for decades.
Exactly. And I think what's good, I brought it with me. There was another case that that our audience might be interested in. This goes all the way back to June of 2025. Okay. Again, another 6-3 decision of the court in favor of parental rights. This involved the state of Maryland. Okay. And in that particular situation, the Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland basically was wanted to require in the curriculum that children be exposed to LBGT-themed books and so forth, all the perversion that we see. And here again, the court said no. And why? And this is a direct quote from Justice Alito. He said, quote, "A government burdens the religious exercise of parents." So basically what was going on there is that the case revolved around religious liberties, religious freedom, and parents were not able to remove their children from being exposed to agendas and ideologies and perversion that the parents did not want their children exposed to, and said this goes against their religious tenets and so forth. And Maryland said, "Oh, no, you're not going to worry about that. No. This is all part of the curriculum. It's part of the education. You can't separate." Court said, "A government burdens the religious exercise of parents when it requires them to submit their children to instruction that poses a very real threat of undermining the religious beliefs and practices that parents wish to instill." End quote. So the court in that also, the majority, recognized the threat. And also the very fact that, that this is something that we're going to talk about with Catholic teaching. I know we're going to get into a little bit, but it's the understanding that the parents, because they are parents, not simply because they are brought children into this world simply, but because of being the begetting of children and because of their relation with their children, they have a fundamental right that cannot be given to anyone else. Yeah. So they can't even give the right away. So even if the parents in this case, let's just say, wanted to give, oh, sure, no problem, state, you do anything you want. Actually, the parents don't have the right to do that, according to our teaching, because that right falls to them. And that others share, including the Catholic Church. So even our own Catholic institutions, our various catechetical programs and parishes don't have the right to overstep the right of the parent. Yeah. Which, again, homeschooling is a good example of this, so forth. So I find, what's happening, in these two cases, thank goodness, the court recognized the legitimate threat. And of course, here, as from a legal point, it's looking at the Constitution as its basis. But the court also recognizes the natural law and recognizes the natural order of things and recognizes the rights of parents. So I find as I'm reading, it's refreshing, right? But the battle's far from over.
Oh, definitely. I know that's something that you've been talking about a little bit more recently too, is just how, and this has been a topic in the broader pro-life, pro-family sphere, about how the tide does seem to have turned against the transgender, gender affirming care, correct. Juggernaut, right. We've been fighting against this trans mentality for so long, and it does seem like the tide has shifted, that people aren't falling for it as easily, that people are recognizing the abuses that have gone on. And we had that with the Cass report. You and I have talked about this a couple of times on the show. So it's just another indication of this hopeful trajectory.
Right. Well, it's like anything else, it's fragile. Yeah. We're dancing on the edge of a knife. Liberty and freedom really demands vigilance. And in this case, for too many decades, we've let our guard down. And we've allowed a progressive agenda to rule and to find positions of authority and influence. Yeah. And who have been the victims but our children. the vulnerable. And now, whether we on the issue of euthanasia, assisted suicide, it's our elderly, our sick that are being the vulnerable there, who are being victimized by an agenda again. And obviously on the front end, when we're dealing with the beginning of life, the same issues are at stake. So this is now a time for us to really not only awaken, to these legitimate threats and these that have been with us, but how do we safeguard? Yeah. So now that we have these wins in the court system, we all know, we've talked about many times, you and I, Colleen, that obviously we look to these wins to help advance the cause, but it really is about hearts and minds. It's about changing hearts and minds. And for parents, which I know we're going to spend a little time talking about, is taking their role seriously and defending their children, even when there is a threat that has greater power, greater ability to pressure, and even to threaten. But we need to, that's where the church comes in again, to stand in solidarity with our parents, with our families, and to fight for their cause. This is where the church's wisdom, comes to bear, and her size is very important. And she has the ability through her various influences within government and within the local community to really rally call people. So this is where the church really needs to be an advocate.
Okay, this is like, I don't know, it just seems like such a obvious thing that schools can't transition children behind their parents' back or allow them to go by other pronouns or anything of that sort. What type of arguments do the people in favor of the secrecy use to try to justify it?
Obviously, what they want to rely upon is autonomy. They want to rely upon the fact that there's an absolute autonomy, and that children are separate from their parents. But let's really got to peel it back more. If we go back to looking at sex education, we have to look at the whole tenets that have been with us for so long, and so here, those who are proponents of sex education, and here what we're talking about is perverse sex education, introducing our young children to things that are to introduce them into the world of the sexual revolution. I mean, it's all driven by an ideology. It's driven by, a belief that these are so-called goods. So this is what drives this. And it just becomes entrenched. It just becomes normalized, by a progressive ideology. So, there is no rational, ability to rationalize this in a sense of legitimize it. It just shows that this ideology runs deep, and it becomes very much a belief. And almost cultic in such a way that we're going to pass this on,
I wasn't intending to imply that it's actually being able to be rationalized. I was thinking more of what they'll tell parents whose children they say are struggling with gender, like dysphoria. They'll say, your child is at risk of suicide if you don't go along with this. So I was just kind of curious what arguments are used, what arguments was California using in support of this to try, when they were going through the court system, to try to justify what
privacy. Okay. I mean, that's just the idea here. I mean, and so they kind of hide behind words, and literally have been able to hide behind law, because remember, the whole abortion, which was fabricated by the Supreme Court, was based on privacy, which is not, as we learned, in the overturning of Roe, and so also the same thing applies to the issue of Oberville with the issue of same-sex union. So again, privacy. So they hide behind these walls. And of course, these children are completely vulnerable, and they think that these teachers are advocating for them, that really have their best interests. And again, I can't read souls, can't read minds. And I mean, there are probably people that legitimately believe in this, and really believe that people are in their wrong bodies. And, and I'm not trying to make fun of that, but the reality is that our children, again, are the victims of it, and so I've heard many stories where parents only learn later, that it was actually teachers that were motivating and advocating and introducing thoughts to the children if they kind of suspected something, a child struggling with gender dysphoria. And so the teachers who advocate for this agenda kind of pushing their own ideology upon a very vulnerable child. Just heard of cases in the Philippines as an example. I was just there, as you mentioned in the beginning. And so, I mean, this is not just in the United States, right? So even in countries where this idea is not in the legal system yet, but it's there. And so it's important for us to see this. And I'm very, like you said, there's a sense of hope. There's a sense of seems that rational thought is coming to bear. But I'm not one to let down my guard too easily.
Common sense.
Yeah, of course.
It's common sense that you shouldn't do this behind a parent's back.
Of course. But you're seeing it now within the whole sporting issue with men in sports. So, but just the idea, when you go back and you read, and I haven't read all of it yet, but even the 3 on the court that were not in favor, their use of language was quite interesting.
Interesting.
I mean, and the point being avoiding to the point, but even using terms that are in themselves confusing. So it's amazing how such intelligent people can't use basic common sense. And as we all know, XY, which science also relates. And what's interesting that, as we discussed most recently, the AMA and other, also the American Association of Psychiatric Physicians and so forth, their statements of recent, very clear that, what's happening. And yet you still have members within society in positions of authority that refuse to accept, what we've all always known. But now this coming into the light and people are seeing a change in the movement. We just got to keep the momentum going. And yesterday's decision is helpful in this regard.
Yes.
And I do believe we're going to see other decisions as a result of that, because now that the court has made that decision, and it's reflected to California, obviously it's a Supreme Court decision. And as a result, it's going to now affect other cases occurring in states across our land.
Yeah, it sets a precedent for what the Supreme Court would rule in this situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
So those, and what we're going to see is, if you remember that the American Medical Association and what I just referenced, that came not long after a major lawsuit was won by a detransitioner.
Yes.
So
yes.
I believe what you're going to see here is this landmark decision is going to now set another stage for other decisions to be made with regard to those that have been kind of holding back still. You're going to see some more change coming.
I remember hearing about that case. Was it basically that she won saying that there was medical malpractice by going through the quote unquote gender affirming care surgeries?
Right.
Okay.
So, but it's just and it could more detailed to that, but it's just the idea that when you begin to see a momentum, it starts picking up like a snowball.
Yeah.
It just starts picking up. And so we just got to be vigilant, be on guard, read, study, know what's happening.
It does feel like this is like the one issue that there's actually been success in trying to not just hold back and restrain it, but be able to start reversing the momentum. Like, we haven't seen that necessarily with abortion. Obviously, Dobbs was a huge win, but abortions are still continuing and growing. And we haven't seen it with like gay marriage, quote unquote marriage, and that whole issue. We haven't necessarily seen it with contraception. So it's very interesting that we finally have a radical ideology that's beginning to hopefully shift backwards. And we can learn lessons from that of what was successful and how do you apply that to these other issues.
Exactly. So that'd be a great conversation to have, because I'm glad you came back to contraception, because that's really what drives the whole abortion industry. It drives all the things that we're talking about ultimately. And so it's just this understanding that, that I just have unlimited freedom. I have an absolute freedom to exercise any way I wish to do so, and which is false. And so as a result, the initial decision, which really looks at the human body as a thing to be used and to be manipulated and to be controlled. And so contraception, really, that mentality comes in. And then you see how the fruit grows from that. And I think it plays out very clearly, in the whole issue of gender dysphoria, that we know that as adolescents deal, with their own body changes and so forth, we know that there's a natural process that's going on in every young boy and girl that's becoming an adolescent, a teenager, that every one of us has gone through in life. And we do know from many studies and just an understanding of growth in adolescence that many children do struggle in a period of time, but naturally 80% or plus, work it through. But this is where, again, parents are vital. This is where, good role models. I mean, also teachers in school
Yeah.
This is something, that we all need. And so to have the opposite happening, where parents aren't doing their due diligence, parents aren't talking to their children about the beauty of human sexuality, what is naturally happening to them, and how to deal with that so-called confusion, and how to not overreact, and at the same time, how to react.
Well, and even if parents are doing that, if your child is spending 8 hours a day at school and then a lot of time online as well, no matter how much effort you're putting in as a parent, if you're not on guard about what this, your child is learning at school or what they're seeing on the internet, it might not be enough to be able to counteract
why
that.
I quoted from Alito, with regard to the Maryland case, because clearly the court, again, they're looking at it from a constitution, how it relates to the law, but they're still making very clear statements. And what's interesting, that I'll point out, and I love this. The understanding here, this is from John Paul II, and I know we're going to get to this in a little bit, but this is from the beautiful document on the family, right? Familiaris Consortio. He speaks of the family as a society in itself. This goes back actually to Rerum Novarum with Leo XIII. And so this understanding that the family itself is a nuclear society. It's a cell, a single cell, as we talk about. And so for the state to look at as if it can kind of trump this very clear in the principle of subsidiarity, this society that already exists. And so to hear Justice Alito speak to this, and to hear other justices speaking, is, I find, again, very, very important, because the state does not have a right, to overstep its own limitation when we're dealing with a society that predates the state.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what that's always the church's position has always been, is that the family existed before.
Yeah.
And the state does not have a right to impose. But there are obligations of the state, and there are duties of the state that we can talk about.
Well, that was anticipating my next question, because I was going to say, obviously, we've talked about on this show how parents are the primary educators of their children. But it also makes sense that the state does have a vested interest in the education of its citizens, because you need an educated, critical thinking populace to be able to have a good state and to be able to just have a healthy society. So what is the proper balance of the role between the parents and the state when it comes to education? And should the state have a say? And if so, what does that look like? And how do you make sure that you're not stepping on the parental rights?
Sure. Well, let's just kind of refresh our audience when it comes to a proper vision of society. So I'm not going to put you on the spot, but the understanding is what creates a true moral society, as John Paul would say, is the proper vision of the dignity of the human person. So here, again, that principle comes to bear. Just use different words. So if my understanding is clear that the society we call the domestic church, the family, has its own rights, all right, as its own little society that must be respected in order to build a proper vision of how we deal with that society. Yeah. So in the sense of the state doesn't look at, oh, you poor little thing, I know better than you. Instead, to see its own proper right, its own proper place, its own role and duty. And then in respect to that, what can we do as a state, as we can put the Catholic Church in, as an institution providing Catholic education? How can we assist this society, right?
Yeah.
Right? To be able to exercise its role. That's the different perspective. Yeah. So instead of, again, Big Brother imposing, instead looking at and respecting what already exists. Again, I love quotes, and I think they're so important, when we look at this. Here, I want to make note of, this is from Pope Francis. This was in Amoris Laetitia. And so I found it, again, very interesting that the Holy Father, again, talks about society. He says, the state offers educational programs in a subsidiarity way. So it's recognizing its proper place in response to that which already exists, supporting the parents in their indeclinable role. Parents themselves enjoy the right to choose freely the kind of education accessible, and of a good quality, which they wish to give their children in accordance with their convictions. So again, with the late Holy Father is reaffirming John Paul, Benedict, and what the church teaches.
Yeah.
And that is how the state should view this society and then serve it. And so, go ahead. I'm going to play devil's advocate.
I am about to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
I like playing devil's advocate. This makes sense to me when you're ending up in a situation where the school system and the state is clearly in the wrong and parents are in the right. You have parents that are trying to raise their children in accord with biological sex. The school is saying, no, we're going to help, quote unquote, transition these children behind your back, and we're not telling you. That makes sense to me. What principles apply when the parents are in the wrong and the state is in the right? So, for instance, you have parents that are trying to raise children to be pro-abortion. They're trying to transition their kids. They want their children to go by whatever the opposite pronouns are at home. And the state says in the school system, no, we're going to teach them that life begins at conception, and we're going to use their biological pronouns. We're not going to use whatever their quote unquote preferred pronouns are. What, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that seems like the same, if you're applying these principles of the parents have the first priority of educating their children and the state should support that, the state in this case doesn't seem like it should support the parents in the way they're trying to educate their children.
I think there's another way also to approach it. First of all, should the state be involved in that particular area? That's the first question. Okay. So here, again, what should the state be engaged in? You mentioned it earlier. So we want to properly educate, to create people with critical thinking, the ability to contribute to the common good. So we're looking at how we look at academics, how we look at liberal education, and not liberal in the progressive, but the humanities, how we form people to be well educated. These issues were not meant to be part of the school's theology or ideology. I go back.
These issues being abortion,
exactly,
like LGBTQ stuff.
Exactly,
all of that. Okay.
Exactly. I'm older now. Going to be 60 years old. I remember what my education was in the public system. This was not part of the formation.
Yeah.
So it's become. This is the problem with it is that there's been intrusion of these ideologies into the school systems. Because why? Because it becomes a tool to bring about the ideal of the progressive movement. But this is not the role of education. So science is clear. And, the whole understanding of human anatomy is clear. So this is where, again, education serves a purpose. Yeah. And that is to help parents in the formation of their children in the sciences, in the mathematics, in the, in the formation of reading, spelling, and all the various things. But when it comes to the formation, whether I agree with it or not, that falls to the parent. It is the parent. So as a Catholic priest, obviously, in dealing with people who don't share those principles, this is a moment of evangelization. This is a moment of formation, teaching, exposing people to, fundamental truths that have been taught in millennia, right? So how do we confront that? So, and this is why, to see, again, I want to read into anything, but to see, at least in this case, these two cases, how the court recognized the role of parents. So there will be people who are listening. Yeah, sometimes parents are wrong. Sometimes parents can, just like what we see with gender dysphoria, can actually want to support that. Well, should the school be involved in that? We can debate that back and forth. But in reality, it's the parent that's the problem here, right? And so should the state overstep and tell the parent they can't? Well, we do know, and this is where it's important, that there is a legitimate time of intervention when a harm is being done. Yeah. Right? And that's what we're talking about here. So in reverse, we know that gender dysphoria is real. We also know that it's harmful, to advocate, for a child, an adolescent who may be struggling for various reasons, to advocate for that which is an untruth. Yeah. Instead, because it's harmful. But see, they don't believe it's harmful. That's the issue. But it is harmful. And what's being told now through all these various things that are happening of late is that it is harmful. And so, and study after study is showing the great harms. And so the idea here is things are being exposed. So this is where, again, the school, if you want to, on that level, should be affirming what is true.
That's what I was kind of getting out of your response was thinking through, trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who might be looking at this, not necessarily not necessarily agreeing with us on these issues, but it does seem like you need to be grounded in the fact that truth exists. Like,
Right.
It doesn't work if you're a relativist, but if you know that truth exists, the parents have the primary duty to educate their children, and the state and the school system assists in that. But
Right.
in a situation where the parents are trying to indoctrinate their child with something that's not true, the school has a duty to uphold truth in school.
Right.
Is
Right.
that kind of a fair? And they're not necessarily stepping on the parent's shoes or trying
Right.
to say you're
Right.
parenting wrong, but they do have a duty to uphold the truth
That's
within
correct.
that school
So
system.
basically, if the parent believes that 1 + 1 is 8,
Mm-hmm.
is the school going to affirm that?
Yeah. And
So if you put 1 + 1 on your test and you put 8 and you're given a failing mark.
Yeah. And the school in that scenario isn't stepping on the parent's rights. The school in that scenario is teaching the truth.
That's right.
But ultimately the parent bears the ultimate responsibility for educating and taking care of their child.
That's correct. But again, because we're dealing with fallen human nature,
Mm-hmm.
and because we're dealing with consequences of that, we do know that there are situations where parents sometimes struggle with themselves with some
Mm-hmm.
mental disabilities and so forth. So there are a lot of things that affect children.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but for myself, and again, I just return to the various personalities that I was very blessed in being raised. And I'm a public school student. Right? I didn't go to Catholic school till I went to seminary,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I can tell you, know, that every one of those teachers that I encountered over the years were solid people
Mm-hmm.
that modeled truth,
Yeah.
and if you stepped in a sense in a way that was not a truth, it wasn't them imposing, some ideological value.
Mm-hmm.
It was them standing on what truly we do understand. And what's rational and what's intelligible.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are the things we've lost and replaced it with relativism. We've
Mm-hmm.
replaced it with ideologies and that are always arbitrary and constantly fluid.
Yeah.
All right. And so it's again why we return to the church and
Mm-hmm.
why the church in her great wisdom has recognized through the centuries the primary role of parents and has defended that role.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it doesn't say it's complete and absolute.
Mm-hmm.
There can be moments when parents are wrong. There can be moments when, at the same time, we don't trample over parental rights.
Mm-hmm.
There's an individual case, you deal with it.
Yeah.
And the same thing would happen in the school system.
Mm-hmm.
But remember that government was an advocate of the family.
Mm-hmm.
We've lost. See, there's a memory that you don't recall.
I don't remember that whatsoever.
You're too young, where the state, just like with marriage, recognized the importance of a stable union between a husband and wife. The state understood the value in that. Yeah. And because of divorce and because of no-fault divorce, the state lost sight of that, and now we see the breakdown that we're having. Yeah. So, but the state had a vested interest, and still has a vested interest in the stability of the family. Yeah. And so the here again, if the school system, I mean, let's look at this. All right.
Okay.
So just practical things. If there is a child that's physically abused, sexually abused, right? Mm-hmm. What is the obligation of legally of a teacher, even a priest? Mm-hmm. What is the obligation? Is to report it. Yeah. All right. We have an obligation to protect that child. Mm-hmm. Even if it means it's the parent, or there is even possibility, the assumption it's the parent. Yeah. So obviously it's case by case, but the idea is recognizing there is a threat. Mm-hmm. If a child comes in with bruises and you can tell something's not right. Yeah. What is your obligation? So here again, we've understood this for centuries, and especially here in the States, in our own school systems, that teachers were considered to be very important in society. Still are. Are very important in society. But there was a greater value placed upon them. We looked to them, as people of good role models and examples. That also people that would defend us. Yeah. That they recognized their role in our lives. So they still have that. Very importantly. So that's why, I'm very concerned and also appreciative of some of the movement I'm seeing within the school systems. Yeah. Right. And here I'm talking about the public systems. Yeah. Right. And I'm a public school product. So I mean, I look at the men and women in my life, and I mean, these people set great examples.
Well, thanks for letting me tease that out a little bit too, because I was just kind of sitting, I hope it wasn't too confusing for the audience, but I was sitting here thinking that the response that somebody would make to what we were talking about is you're only siding with the parents over the school because you ideologically agree with the parents and not the school. So I was trying to figure out which principles apply in the reverse situation and how you would respond to that critique. And it seems like grounding it in truth and grounding it in care for the child and protection of the family, but also recognizing that abuses do happen does seem to be the proper approach.
And the proper role of education is the formation, and it's based upon very things that are objective, right? And so, it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's amazing. Again, when we look at the abuses that have happened, it's all based on one's own personal views. And, but that is, I mean, again, think about this as an educator, as well, is that someone comes in and, you can have an opinion, we can have a disagreement, and we might have different approaches, and that's all fine. Right. But when we start talking about something that, we can read a book together, you and I, and we might have completely different approaches of how we receive the book.
Yeah.
But then I come in and tell you as my math professor that, this formula that we've been using for whatever, centuries, whatever, I want to use my own. I mean, you're going to look at me and say, no, it's not happening. So these are things, that help us to stay very clear. And the arbitrary disappears. And also back to the role is the understanding of even with its possible abuse, even with its possible shortcomings, the recognizing the role of the family helps us stay on that narrow path.
Yeah.
And it helps the state through its agencies, right? So because let's just look at this. See, we're looking at this from an American perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to where there's a socialist system. How about we go over to where communism exists? Let's talk about what's going on in systems where the state really does not respect the parent's role at all and sees the child as a product of the state.
Yeah.
So they're a completely different view. Yeah. So again, this is why an objective truth, which is what the church is speaking to, that preexisted before the state. Before communism, before socialism, before the American, dream. All this is very important.
Yeah. No, I remember hearing from someone who grew up in communist Poland how they basically went to school all day and then they spent the entire evening unlearning everything they'd learned that day at school.
Well, that's happened in the United States.
Yeah.
Because parents, don't have the ability, to put their child into a private system, or maybe don't have the ability to homeschool their children. So they're forced, and some, and I use that word forced, to tolerate an evil in the school system. And then at nighttime, they got to sit there with their child and just undo it all.
Well, also, I remember Father Giordano brought this up when he was on the show the first time that I interviewed him when he was here for the regional directors meeting in 2023. And he had a great quote from somebody, I don't remember who it was, talking about how truth and like the point of education is imposing reality on the mind, and ideology is imposing the mind and trying to force it, like reality to fit that envision in your mind. And so it does seem like if you're talking about the point of education,
that's right,
being able to help children see the truth, acknowledge the truth, and empowering parents to be able to educate their children to do that as well. And when you start having schools get into just ideology and trying to make the child believe whatever they want them to believe and say that reality lines up with whatever's in their head, that's when you end up in a whole host of issues.
Right. And it's a rabbit hole because it's no end to it. But you're making me think, and I wish I could remember, it's a university professor.
Okay.
And actually president. And I'm not going to say it because I think I'm right, but I'm not going to say where because I don't want to make sure, I don't want to misquote. But I appreciate, because he was telling a story about meeting a young student, excited to come to the university.
Okay.
And says, I cannot wait to come and share my ideas with you. And the president looked and says, son, I'm not interested in your opinion. The reason why you come here is so that you can learn and be informed. What wisdom do you bring? What experience do you bring? And so just this idea that, so what Father Giordano shared with you really is the role of education and really helping us and stretching us, to recognize. I love, being, a student of science, and recognizing, presenting a hypothesis and proving it.
Yeah.
Right. And it's based on an observable truth. It's based on fact. It's based on what you can observe and you can prove.
Yeah.
And you have to repeat it in order to be consistent that it can be repeated. So there's just the idea that, just because I believe something is real doesn't mean it's real. And so this is, again, where that's what I love about reading. And opening oneself to possible possibilities and trying to work toward an answer, towards something.
Yeah.
And that's what I always appreciate about math. I mean, the formulas were so wonderful because you just follow the formula and you will get to the answer of this. But some things are not as easy as that.
Yeah.
And
well, go ahead.
No, but I'm glad you brought up Father Giordano for that because, he obviously is involved in higher education and has the opportunity to really see things from that perspective on a daily basis. And that's great to see. But I imagine, and again, sometimes, when a student would come in and present, a frame of mind and you would say, okay, show me where you're getting this from. Where is this? And it's always, well, I think that's wonderful. I'm glad you think, and I'm glad you have an opinion on something. What are you basing this upon?
Yeah.
What it is. So this is where, and this also happens within families, right? That's a role of mom and dad too.
Yeah. Is
to expose us to truth, to help stretch us, to broaden our perspective on things. But they're anchoring that in an objective truth. They're helping us to see. And because our curiosity can lead us in pathways that are not healthy for us, and the same thing in formal education.
Yeah. No, that's so true. What guidance does the church offer for how the church or the state should support parents in the education of children? Does the state...
I knew you were going to ask a question. So I'll just read my statement. Very simple. When parents choose to partner, that very, very important word, partner with schools, whether they be in the parochial systems, private system, public system, all right? So the school exercises a function, education, formation, that belongs by natural right to the parents. See, the parent cannot give that right away. They can ask me to partner as a Catholic institution. They can ask me as a private tutor, help me in this, right? Like we see in homeschooling. Sometimes parents are well educated in certain fields, but when it comes to physics and it comes to chemistry, they're a little lost. And would you help me? So you're asking me to help you partner. So that's a very powerful word. And here, so the state does have a role. And you said it very beautifully at the very beginning of our program, right? And so the state has a role. We're not, neither one of us are saying, and I'm not saying by any means, and the things I'm relating to is that the state just has to sit on the sidetrack.
Yeah.
The state has its own functionality and its own obligations, and it tries to seek that end by providing these various agencies and services. Sometimes it gets so massive that we lose sight of what it really fundamentally is supposed to be about, right? And so, and this is where it's important to come back to what you asked me earlier, and in the sense of how should the state respond? And I said, by going back to that moral vision, that if the state recognizes, as it did in its ups and downs, in the sense of its struggles and successes, that this society called the family pre-exists. And it has its own authority, its own obligations, and its own rights that are separate from the state.
Yeah.
And so if the state looks at that and respects that fundamental right, right? Fundamental right, then it knows how to approach, right? And it doesn't impose, it proposes.
Okay.
Right? Now, obviously, if we're talking about threats, that's a different question. It's a different situation, right? And so, because we know stories and we can tell stories of bad directions of families and cults and all, right? We know that. But we should make those like we do in other situations, the reason why we do something, right? It's the very fact that, we have a direction and we follow it. And that's what we do. So also, it's the right. The state may not supplant that natural right. That's the other thing I wrote down. So it goes back to what you were saying earlier. So the school does not have that right to supplant the parents' rights, right? Even if you disagree with them.
Yeah.
Completely disagree. You don't have that right. The only thing you have a right to is to advance truth in your institution and to counter through education what a person may believe. So you might believe that abortion is all right. You might believe that. And to come in and say, well, that's not a human being. It's not a child. It has, but what can we say from science? What do we know? Okay. So you can confront that plain and simple with what we know and what science teaches. Very clear. That truth is there. Yes. So we can, there's ways of approach, right? Even when you're confronting parents, primary caregivers that might have a different ideology, different perspective, different opinion, different belief system, right? And so because what the court is dealing with, it didn't deal with Catholicism, even though it's heavily with Catholic schools, right? Many of them, right? But what it's dealing with is looking at the Constitution and freedom of religion, and also the exercise of that freedom, and the ability to have due process, and all these various things, that are there, that the Constitution, from a legal perspective. Yeah. But so these are things that are very, very important, and as we start looking in a sense of advancing. This is, again, what I would say as from a Catholic perspective. This is why our Catholic institutions must live by our Catholic principles and to respect parents. And listen, trust me, I have been at odds with parents, right? Because of their belief systems, right? Because something in the school, right, that we taught, a moral principle, they may not agree with. Well, that's fine. That's your decision, right? Yeah. But as long as they're in this institution, this is what this institution will advance, because this is what the church teaches and advances. You can choose to remove your child from that system. That's your decision. That's your choice. But I'm not going to change course on this because you don't agree with it. Not happening.
I think another big difference between that and what was going on in California too, if again you're on the outside and you don't believe in necessarily truth and you're seeing this as opposing ideologies, right. For people that think that what the Catholic Church teaching is just an ideology, which it's not, it's truth. But the difference in that situation too is, well, obviously that the parent can remove their child, but also that the Catholic school isn't being secretive about the types of things that they're teaching. If you were to walk in as a parent who thinks that abortion is fine and believes in LGBTQ ideology and all of that and went to the school and said, what are you teaching my child? The Catholic school is going to turn around and say, we're teaching them that life begins at conception and there's two biological sexes and this is all grounded in truth. And so that's another big difference and why you can't just flip-flop the situation and that's correct.
That's correct. Exactly. And then and like you're turning back to what was behind that lawsuit, and that was basically the school state hiding what was happening from parents, and then using pronouns and language to actually support what this child is struggling with, and instead of addressing it and keeping parents away from it. And, so they are different, but it's good to come back to it because that's what that case was dealing with. The one in Maryland was dealing with a very similar thing, but more about curriculum. But the curriculum was LBGT. Yeah. That was the whole curricula that they're trying to advance. And so both cases are looking again and coming back to what is the role of parent. Who is the primary educator, so forth and so on. So it's both cases for me are a landmark. This one very particular because it's this is something that we've been fighting, for several years, on the issue of keeping parents out of the situation, and so not recognizing the rights of parents, right. And so this is, again, I would say this, and is when it comes to the role of the state, is also there are cases that we still have to deal with where for example, the state can set standards, and it does. Yeah. It sets academic standards, accreditation. That's part of the role of the state. right?
Okay.
And so that you can see how there are roles in the sense, the various ways in which a degree in science will be given. Each university obviously can approach, but there are going to be a standard for accreditation, right? Which then recognizes across the boundaries of the states that these are legitimate degrees and so forth and so on. So the state does have that right, because it is exercising its own authority, and it's also, bestowing through its institutions, private and public, these degrees and so forth and so on. So the idea is it's important. So I definitely would like my cardiologist to have a true valid degree and expertise in the science and being able to provide my care.
Yeah.
All right. I do not want the local plumber, to who's certified in his expertise doing cardiovascular surgery.
Yeah.
Right. So the state does have a responsibility, and it does have a legitimate authority to exercise that right that it has.
Yeah.
But in the same time, when it comes to the role and rights of parents, the state has an obligation to respect.
Yeah.
Using Pope Francis's words, Leo the 13th, looking at this society, it should not trample, no matter how small it is, that society. Within the home, the domestic church, this little society in itself, this is where those core values are taught. Right. And this is where, again, the values of the family are made to come to bear. Right. Yeah. And so whether that be in religious formation itself, in combination with the formation of many things that a child is formed in underneath that roof, because that is where the child learns those core values and gospel values, how to apply them, how to relate. It's a society because they work together and they support each other. There's a common good that exists within the family structure. Yeah. That is within the family that is learned, right? Society can partner with a parent to provide mechanisms and abilities to assist the parents in that ability, right? Partnership. Yeah. Partnership. Once we start reaching levels within the society, which is has its own mechanizations and its own structures of support and bestowal, right? So these are things that are natural, right? Because they're important. We live in a common society. We want electrical engineers to know what they're doing. We want structural engineers to know what they're doing. So there are standards, but those are not teaching. They're teaching value, but a different kind of value. Yeah. They're not teaching fundamental values of formation, of the sense of those values of the dignity of life, the beauty, of the human person, that about God Himself, about my responsibility toward God, nature. That comes within the home, right? So this, I think we're looking, that word partnership is very important, and that the right of the parent and that the rights of the state should not be in contradiction, and it should not be imposing or over imposing its own right, which must be in respect to the fundamental right of parents. That's what ultimately the church is saying, and what we're saying here, and just various ways of approach. So I appreciate what happened on yesterday. It was something that we were hoping the court would see and would recognize, and thank goodness that the majority here, 6 of the justices, recognized it and defended it as they did, and they referred back to the Maryland case. Nice, right? Yeah. So the Maryland case set a precedent as well. It spoke a language. So these are very important. So I believe, just returning to what you said a little earlier, where do we go from here? It's important that we keep the momentum going. That for right now, this kind of just bolstered us up again and says, keep going, right? And we know that the battle is far, far from over, Colleen. We know that the ideologues who have been advancing the principles of the sexual revolution are not going to give up. They're not going to roll over. They lost this one in this particular case, but we also know that there is a proposed bill from out of California to the federal level, trying to, if the Democratic Party were to get back into positions of authority, that they would actually create a bill that would stand to rise, in a sense, or legitimize the whole transgender movement. Oh. So these are the dangers that are there. Yeah. And so and they're out there. And so we need to be alert. We need to be on guard. We need to be working in our local systems of community to advocate for the family, advocate for the good, advocate for what's truth, defend our children from these ideologies, and not let our guard down.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this discussion today, Father. I was really glad to hear about this yesterday, and I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about it this week.
And my column that's coming up will be a little more detailed, and the links to the various articles and various quotes and various statements will be there. So I would just encourage our audience to go back and read. It'll be out soon.
For sure. I'll link it in the description as soon as it is. And to all of our audience, please like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, please like this video and leave us a 5-star review. And as always, keep on living the culture of life. God bless.